Let's take a look at the start of reform in the industrial age. We got to start with the idea of social Darwinism. This is an idea that comes from England, from English philosopher Herbert Spencer, who took Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution and applied them to human society. Meaning, the reason that some people are successful and happy and rich and wealthy is because um, they were better suited to society. They were just better people. The same way the dodo bird went extinct because it wasn't a it didn't have the right characteristics to thrive. That's why some people are poor, according to Herbert Spencer. This idea is accepted in the United States, and one of the big proponents of this idea here in the United States is William Graham Sumner. And he even goes as far to argue that government action for the poor was a waste and unnatural. Just like you wouldn't try to preserve some animal that was naturally going to go extinct, you shouldn't try to help out the poor with government money, with tax money. However, these ideas are really challenged in 1879 with the publishing of Progress and Poverty by Henry George, who points out that in 1879 the US economy is booming. It's doing better than it ever has. And poverty should be disappearing. But in reality, what's happening is that gap between the rich and the poor is growing. This book inspires a lot of other people to work to try to fix this problem. One person inspired by that book was Clarence Darrow, who was a lawyer, and he's really the first person in America to argue and point out that people don't commit crimes because they are inherently bad, that those people are naturally criminals and they're just born destined to do that. He's the one to really draw a connection between poverty and crime and really points out that poverty is the cause of a lot of crime. Richard Ely was an economist who spoke out against some of the dominant theories of the time, mainly laissez faire economics. He says that economists should not support theories that only help the rich, like the laissez faire approach to government. Laissez faire should not be an excuse just to let people starve. And out of this idea, he founds the American Economic Association. And what they did was link economics to social problems like crime and hunger. And their organization really urged the government to take economic action, to do some economic intervention. And then Thorstein Veblen, that name you see down there at the bottom, he wrote The Theory of the Leisure Class. And he goes on to attack laissez faire even more. He points out that it's just an excuse for them to be greedy. Edward Bellamy wrote this book, Looking Backward, in 1887. It's very popular. At one point, it was selling 10,000 copies a week. And what he's doing in this book is proposing that the workers own the means of production and that the profits from a factory are not all collected by one owner, but are shared among all the workers. What he's talking about is a socialist economy. He's not saying we need competition. He's saying we need cooperation for us all to be successful. These ideas really took root by 1890, only 3 years after the book was published. There are Bellamy clubs in 27 states calling for his changes. In other words, calling for socialism. So where does religion play into all of this? Well, the old idea of religion is that you can save your soul and save other souls so that you or somebody else can have a better afterlife. But really, we shouldn't worry about life here on earth. The idea is that poverty is a result of sin. And there's a strong belief that, yeah, equality is nice, but God doesn't necessarily believe in equality. And God isn't going to try to guarantee equality. The new idea is what's called social gospel movement. And this is an idea that we can improve people's living conditions and save their souls. Church members around the country unite to try to help others in their society. And it's out of this social gospel movement that the church really becomes a community center in many towns and cities. For example, we have Boy Scout troops starting to meet there. We have food pantries run out of churches. So the way many churches function today really starts at this time during the social gospel movement. Washington Gladden was one of the premier thinkers of the social gospel movement. He wrote Applied Christianity in 1886. And he says that competition is bad. He said that workers and owners should be working together and everyone should try to help the poor. It's at this time that a lot of churches are sending missionaries, not abroad, but into poor urban areas. William Bliss was a missionary who worked in Boston. Lewis Pease worked in the poorer parts of New York City. And Alex Irvine joined him in New York City, but he's a Jewish missionary. We also have settlement houses forming at this time. These are sometimes Christian-based, sometimes not, but what they are is a community center in poor neighborhoods. And what they did was they offered classes and they offered resources. They were a place to sleep if people were homeless. They were often a soup kitchen and food pantry for people in need. And they provided classes like learning to speak English, cooking classes, childcare classes. They even offered free childcare for working families. And the settlement houses really served a lot of the immigrant families. One of the most famous ones is Hull House in Chicago, and that was run by Jane Addams. So in 1893, we have a panic. We would call it a depression today. In fact, the Depression of 1893 was the worst ever in United States history until 1929. So the effect on charity is that people aren't going to be giving as much to charity. Charity organizations have their funds severely limited by this economic downturn, and they used to try to change people's behavior, but people were really reluctant to ask for help. We also see at this time the emergence of social workers. These are not just people who are providing aid to the poor and needy, but these are people who are going to try to study the cause of poverty and try to eliminate those causes. So these professional social workers are collecting data on income and housing and jobs and health and the habits of the poor. Some of the more famous ones are Walter Wyckoff, and he wrote The Workers in 1891. He basically went undercover. He became a laborer. Despite his upper society upbringing, he became a laborer and worked as a laborer and then wrote about his experiences. We've heard a little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois already. He really focused on and wrote a lot about urban African Americans, and his most famous book is The Souls of Black Folk, 1903. And Lillian Pettingill, we see some women involved in these causes as well. She took up the cause of domestic servants and wrote extensively about how hard their life was. And Helen Campbell wrote about female workers in general. And in 1900, the National Civic Foundation is created of these bunch of social workers organize a national organization with a goal of trying to reform urban life. It's out of these people's efforts that the progressive movement is going to spring, which we'll talk about later.